Yes, good morning. Welcome to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. It's Friday, the 18th of September, 2020. My name is Pete Fairbairn. I'm your host. And as always, I'm joined by one of the nation's top sports journalists. And today, Sydney Morning Herald, Rugby Union, cricket reporter, Tom Decent's on the line. How are you, Tommy?
Very well, Pete. How are you?
Doing very well. Always a pleasure to catch up with you bright and early this morning. And a bit of a treat. Not only have we both gotten up and read all the papers to find out the big stories to talk about just for your listening pleasure, but Tommy's also been writing some as well. And that's where we're going to start in the Sydney Morning Herald with a story that Tom's written with his colleague Zoe Samios. It's off the back of a story we spoke about yesterday. John Stenshall in The Australian reported interest from Channel 9 and Stan, their streaming platform, in broadcasting rights for the Australian Rugby Union beyond this season. Of course, the broadcast deal with Fox coming to a close at the end of 2020. Tom, yourself and Zoe have followed up on that story, and according to your article, it could be actually a little bit of gamesmanship coming from the governing body. Nine declined to comment. However, television sources suggest that they haven't expressed any formal interest in the rights. They haven't made a bid, or they haven't discussed how much money they'd be prepared to pay. Suggestion perhaps that the Rugby Australia, as part of its negotiations with the likes of Optus Sport, potentially Network 10 and Fox Sports, might be playing a bit of gamesmanship here and creating some competitive tension. Can you just talk me through the current state of play in that broadcast market and when we're going to perhaps hear some news, because we're almost into the final 3 months of the year, and for a sport that doesn't have a lot of money in the bank and doesn't have a lot of security around what its future competition models are going to look like, it must be starting to get pretty concerning.
Yeah, and it's probably worth getting the disclaimer out there that Nine obviously owns the Herald, which I write for, just to get that out by way of transparency. But look, I mean, yeah, who's in, who's out? There's clearly a lot of fascinating backroom chats and deals being made and talk of who's in and who's out. As a network source put to me, it's probably worth, more looking at your watch rather than your, more looking at your calendar rather than your watch. So that obviously sort of says as to sort of we're not imminent by way of a decision or a deal being done. But as you say, yeah, look, I mean, yeah, the Nine thing was definitely interesting. You could never say never, but at the moment it's not a high priority to our understanding. Clearly Fox are thereabouts, but I mean, you could say that any network in any sport at the moment, if they can get some sport on TV for a reasonable price, they will take it. And that's going to be the key factor. What's the right price? We know Rugby Australia are desperate to offload these rights. We know that they have been approaching the networks. We know that they have come to Nine and say, hey, what do you think? Hugh Marks has clearly had a look at it. Rugby league, possibly cricket, already have the tennis. There's various things amongst the Nine stable that probably take priority over rugby. But look, there's been talks definitely, but in terms of a bid or even talk about money, we know that's not the case, and that might not be what some figures are telling others at other networks, which was very interesting yesterday when that came out. So we don't know what a comp though is for next year. That hasn't been formally announced. We know Rugby Australia have got their offering of State of the Union that they want to throw out, Club Rugby. It's all in one bundle, and we know they're working very hard to make that happen, and it's a very high priority. But look, we're still a little way away from that. If I was a betting man, it would be that Foxtel are going to come in at the right price, and they'll be looking to lowball Rugby Australia too. Network 10, we understand, are still interested but don't want to pay full freighter as much as they have been. Rugby Australia will be flexible with the deal they offer. So there's a long way to play in this, and never say never with the Nine aspect, but there'd be a lot of hurdles to overcome. The Stan element, they would need a whole new commercial structure for that. It's not something that's been thought about or discussed at all in there. So a long way to run at this point.
Yeah, and I want to make the point as well, and you mentioned it, Rugby Australia, huge challenge for them, not of their own making, that we don't know what the competition model looks like next year. And, for interim chief executive Rob Clark, a massive challenge to try and be innovative and come up with some different ideas and concepts. They're not all going to hit the mark, but thinking outside the square is critical here. And also, for what it's worth, I think Fox Sports they've obviously spent and invested a lot of money in the sport over recent years. We know Patrick Delaney has excluded rugby when listing the tier 1 sports that his organisation prioritises. But they've had a role to play in the current status of rugby as well. And I just hope whoever broadcasts it beyond 2020 is willing to take some risks and do some things a little bit differently and not necessarily stick to the status quo. We've got lots of good friends and great people who've been involved in Fox Rugby's broadcasts over recent years, and hopefully, we'd love to see them all stay involved. But at the same time, an injection of some new energy and some new formats. And you only have to look at the Aussie Rugby Show, which Stephen Hoyles, Sean Maloney, Lou Ransom, and Drew Mitchell are doing off their own back, and how well that's going on Rugby Pass and broadcasting into New Zealand to see that people want to watch interesting, innovative content. So be fascinating to see how that one plays out. We'll stay in rugby union for our second story. This one comes from Wayne Smith in the Australian today, and he's got confirmation that Brumbies coach Dan McKellar won't be joining the Wallabies as forwards coach following the conclusion of the Super Rugby season. It's been speculated for a long time that incoming Wallabies coach Dave Rennie had targeted McKellar to come in and oversee the set piece and the forwards play. At the very least for this season. Many believe that McKellar is the long-term successor or the heir apparent to Rennie, who's already said on the record that he thinks the next Wallabies coach should be an Australian. However, with Brumbies assistant coach Peter Hewitt taking up a coaching job overseas in Japan at the end of this season, and fellow Brumbies assistant Laurie Fisher declaring himself unavailable to do that Wallabies forwards job for family reasons, McKellar doesn't want to leave the Canberra side in the lurch and feels he has an obligation and responsibility to stay with the Brumbies throughout the pre-season. With all that in mind, Jeff Parling, the former England international and British Lion, who's been the line-out coach of the Melbourne Rebels since retiring there a couple of years ago, is going to come in. He'll work alongside Petrus du Plessis, recently retired South African who played for Rennie at Glasgow. He comes in as the scrum coach. It's a pretty inexperienced set-piece coaching combination. Are you happy with Dave Rennie's coaching staff? I mean, obviously, he's also got Matt Taylor in there as well and Scott Wisemantle. Do you think he's got a good combination of coaches, or do you think it's a bit of a blow for the Wallabies not to have McKellar's services?
Oh, it's certainly a blow to not have Dan, but I think by way of the fact he's going to be very much in the Wallabies mix in years to come, and obviously you've spoken on the show before with Christy about the fact that Dan is very likely going to be highly in the reckoning for the next Wallabies coaching gig. Dave Rennie wants a Wallabies coach to be Australian after him, so we know that's obviously going to be in the pipeline. But is it a massive blow? I mean, it's pretty admirable from Dan. Like, he doesn't strike me as a guy who is coaching to sort of be a head coach at the Wallabies or be within that Wallabies setup as soon as possible. He's plied his trade, and if obviously it is true that he's going to be staying in Canberra for a while longer to make sure that team's okay now that Pete Hewitt is sort of leaving to take up a job in Japan. I think that's very admirable. In terms of Jeff Parling, obviously, great resume. He'll be able to do a job for now. I mean, that's not to say Dan can't come in years to come. Obviously, we know COVID's thrown up a number of challenges. We know that, there was some toing and froing between RA and Rennie to try and get Petrus du Plessis even as a scrum coach. So it's good to see that Dave's got his full allotment of coaches there. I think it's a good mix. I mean, clearly Dan and what he's done at the Brumbies has been outstanding by way of that forward pack. Arguably, the forward pack of the competition have been for a number of years. Line out and maul has just been outstanding, and you actually would probably like to have seen him in Wallabies colours, get his hands on those guys and really work his magic in that aspect. And if this year's not to be, then that's fine. And I think Jeff's a fairly good replacement there. So I'm not too fussed overall, but it is interesting. And I know Dan had been linked with that job earlier in the year, but as you say, uncertain times, so much water under the bridge, and he's in no rush to really to get there by the sounds of it. And I don't mind that. I don't mind that he's going about that approach, and we've got a fairly handy coach in the wings anyway.
Yeah, and to your point, I think it shows great loyalty to that Brumbies organisation. And by the time the next episode of the show is filmed on Monday, we could be talking about a Super Rugby AU premiership winning coach in Dan McKellar. Our third story today takes us to the AFL competition. AFL Chief Executive Gil McLachlan has completed his quarantine on the Gold Coast, and we know he's not staying within that AFL bubble. He's now moved into private accommodation, which will allow him, to meet with government and to meet with other people from outside that AFL bubble. And he spoke yesterday about the game and what it's going to look like in 2021. We know this season, due to COVID, the 23-round season was reduced to an 18-round season, with each team playing each other once. And also, because of the short turnarounds from a player welfare perspective, we've seen 20-minute quarters reduced to just 16. It looks like it's going to be back to the future with that 23-round season next year, with round one penciled in for late March and hopefully at the MCG, all things going to plan. But McLachlan has also said that the game is unlikely to return to the 20-minute quarters. He's still looking at ways in which they can keep some short turnarounds, and from that perspective, from a player welfare point of view, he needs to keep the games a little bit shorter in length. We're looking at anywhere from 16 to 19-minute quarters, more likely around that 17, 18-minute mark. It's certainly changed the game. It's made it a lot tougher for teams who fall behind early to actually come back, and we've seen a fair few lopsided, one-sided games. Obviously, less goals being kicked as well because there's less time on the field, and Tommy Hawkins is likely to win the Coleman medal with the lowest tally of goals in a season since World War I. Is the fabric of AFL football at question? Tom, with the AFL looking to retain those shorter quarters next season?
100%. I think it's a stinker. Like, I understand why they brought it in, absolutely, to begin with, but like, as soon as the competition goes back to some semblance of normality, I would expect they would go back. But yeah, this story's absolutely done me. Like, I mean, you're trying to equate it to other sports, like in rugby league. If we're going to have a condensed rugby championship, but we've got to play 6 games in 5 weeks, let's only play 66-minute games of footy. Like, to me, that just does not make sense. And I've watched a bit of Aussie rules this season. Like, I know that, as you say, clearly the scores haven't been as great. You could argue that the standard, even to start with, was very below possibly where it could have been. And reduced quarters, and then you think about how that affects statistics going forward. Like, when you've got guys who are kicking goals per season, and now some of those records are probably never going to be broken if they're missing out on sort of 4 minutes a quarter. Like, I don't know. I just think it's an absolute stinker of a call. And I'd love them to bring it back. And like, I'm not obviously going to lose sleep at night over this, but it just seems that there's lots of flow-on effects from this when and I'm assuming the punters would want them back. Or is it sort of are people happy for that to be?
Look, I couldn't tell you exactly what the sentiment is. For full transparency, Tom and I, we don't talk what our angles are going to be and what our opinions are on this before we record the show. But I'm with you 100%. I can't fathom how you can justify this far out. We're talking 6 months from the start of next season. We don't know what the COVID environment's going to be. I would have thought you're preparing to go back to situation normal. The only way I could see them justifying the shorter quarters is if, for economic reasons, they had to look to schedule a longer than usual season and try and play 26, 27, 28 matches in order to try and make up for some of the lost revenue of this year. Yes, in that instance, I could understand it. But if we're going back to a 23-match season, why do those quarters need to be shorter? We've also seen the AFL has the ability to make decisions on the fly, and I can't help but think that if COVID does impact the season next year and does influence in any way, they can make that change closer to the time if they need to. I'm with you. I wouldn't have chosen those words, but I'm going to run with it. I think it is a stinker. Let's move to our next story. And for anyone who like me, likes to get up nice and early in the morning, there was a lovely way to start yesterday. That was watching the last 10 or 15 overs of Australia coming from on the brink, seemingly, to win the third and final one-day international against England over in England itself. Australia was 5 for 73, chasing 307 when Glenn Maxwell and Alex Carey got together. Carey scoring his first 100 in Australian colours, and Maxwell his first in the ODI format for 5 years. It was a wonderful comeback, and it's England's first loss in a one-day international series at home for a long, long time. It flies a little bit under the radar because we're getting to the business end of the footy season, but how important was that ODI series win against England, Tommy? And, let's look at the fact that Steve Smith didn't play due to concussion. David Warner didn't really have much of an impact on the series. It's some guys like Carey, Glenn Maxwell, Mitch Marsh has had an impact. Adam Zampa's bowled really well. It looks like the Aussie one-day team is building quite nicely.
Yeah, there's a lot to like, wasn't it? I went to bed when they were about 3 for 60, England starting off, and then obviously you wake up, see your phone, see there's a win, and you go, oh, wow, they've chased down 300. Look at the scorecard, and you're slowly going down. And when there's not 100 or a big score in those first 5, you think, how on earth have they pulled this off? But obviously Carey and Maxwell saved the day, an incredible, 212-run partnership. Unbelievable win when you think of it. You try and think of, I'd be right up there in terms of Australian ODI chasers. And, obviously context, obviously you're throwing forward to the World Cup, and how does that look? There's clearly a long way to go before that. But, by way of confidence, hats off to Cricket Australia and the ECTV for making this series happen. It probably didn't have to happen, but they, saw value in trying to get some cricket over there where possible. And, albeit not in front of crowds, it's been a bloody good ODI series. Lots to like, as you say, Steve Smith not playing, Warner not firing, but a lot to like from the bowlers. Even Starks performed admirably there. It's just good to have cricket back, and even just the delight that the players took in that win over there. Clearly, it's been a very tough place to win. We know what happened last year, and we know how the World Cup played out and the circumstances around that. So that would have been really nice to get one back. And fantastic game. And I know all of us in the office crowded around watching the highlights of that yesterday morning. Pretty proud of the Aussie cricketers over there who've also, on a side note, got a massive summer ahead of them. Bubbles, all sorts of hurdles ahead of them, and being away from their families. So hope they enjoyed a few champagnes there at the ground.
That's exactly it. And I should say as well, Josh Hazlewood's had a fantastic series. I remember voicing at the time my disbelief that he wasn't selected for the Cricket World Cup last year. Such an accomplished cricketer, in all formats of the game. And he's clearly shown that he's in Australia's best ODI 11 as well moving forward. Finally today, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but before we finish off, a bit of fun. Robert Craddock in the Courier Mail has written an article this morning. COVID-19 has turned the sporting world upside down, and it might never change back. He's looking at 8 ways in which COVID has changed the sporting world in Australia. He talks about the importance of broadcasting dollar. We know that broadcast deals were already probably on the decline before COVID hit. Certainly that's the case more than ever now. He lauds strong leadership and big voices in the likes of Volandis and Gil McLachlan, and how their sports have been able to ride the storm with some big, strong leaders at the helm. Talks about the fact that whether it be coaching staff or commercial operations within sporting organisations, they've been trimmed a lot. Perhaps they'd grown exponentially too large before this occurred. What's the number one, or what are a couple of the changes that you've seen through COVID, Tommy? I can see you're on mute, so don't forget to unmute there for me. But what are the changes that you've seen over COVID in the sporting world that you think are going to stay like this moving forward?
Ooh. Zooms, journos traveling around with teams. That may be, those days may be gone. Very different way of trying to cover sport. Obviously that's on the different side of the fence. Budgets, by way of team budgets, are clearly possibly always been in question, but there's been, a lot of money in the coffers to do so. And I think people are going to have to get very strict about that. By way of teams traveling around the world, business class, hotels, it's pretty luxurious lifestyle when you look at it. I think those days may be closer to gone. What else?
One of the other things he talks about, Tommy, while we're there, is that champion teams find ways to win no matter the circumstances. You look at the Melbourne Storm, you look at the Brumbies are a great example, because even before COVID, they got pushed to Newcastle during pre-season with bushfires on. Then they had a mumps infection. Champion teams, good, strong organisations, just find a way to crack on with it, don't they? Yeah,
for sure. Interesting to note, as you say, the adversity, teams having to travel during, day-to-day, fly in, fly out matches. That's been a real tough one there. Being in a bubble as well, you could argue that sometimes that has a positive effect on sides, just being away from family, being able to purely concentrate on the sport. I know we talk about when teams go to South Africa for the rugby, they always talk about that being a great bonding exercise. Obviously, there's, things they probably can't do now that they used to be doing by way of going to bars and all bonding and that kind of stuff. But in terms of, being in a bubble with your teammates, purely focusing on your sport, you could argue that that's been a help to some sides who are in that bubble. It's just fascinating as to how long this will drag on for. When will be the last remnants of this pandemic? Obviously, there's a long way to go, but for the foreseeable future, it's going to be as is. Hopefully in 5 years' time, we're still not talking about, COVID and the lasting effects of it. But economically, that's probably, likely at this stage until we can get, everything back and running.
Yeah, I have a dream of one day returning to a Boxing Day test with 100,000 fans at the MCG, but I feel like we're a little while off that yet. And as one of the media fraternity's greatest tourists, I feel for you and send you my condolences at this time that you can't be travelling, into overseas, for example, for the upcoming Bledisloe Cup series. I know that Auckland bars are making urgent preparations for the fact that you won't be visiting this time around. Tommy, fantastic to catch up with you as always. Huge weekend of sport ahead. Look forward to having all our listeners and watchers back next week on the Best On Ground Kickoff. But thank you so much, Tommy, and we'll talk to you soon.
Pleasure, Pete.
Have a cracking day. It's the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. We'll see you next week.